And welcome back, everybody, to Hands On Apologetics. And we're going to talk about an argument for the existence of God, which I think is one of the most accessible arguments. It's also a very attractive argument. It's almost not just apologetic defensive argument, but I think it's so attractive it could be an evangelistic tool as well. And that's the argument from desire. And help us kind of unpack the argument from desire, we have our good friend Joe Heschmeyer with us. Joe is a popular author, speaker, blogger, and podcaster. He joined Catholic Answers staff in March 2021 after 3 years as an instructor at Holy Family School of Faith in Overland Park, Kansas. He's earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Kendrick Glennon Seminary in St. Louis and a sacred theology degree from the Angelicum. He's a regular contributor at Catholic Answers Live, Catholic Answers Focus, and Catholic Answers Magazine. And he has started a new podcast apostolate of Shameless Popery, which we're also going to talk about too. So Joe, hey, welcome back to Hands On Apologetics.
Thanks. Good to be back.
Yeah. So, I'm fired up about the podcast ministry and today's topic. So why don't we tackle today's topic, and we'll save some time at the end of the segment. Argument from desire. I don't think most people are familiar with that. They may have heard of Thomas's, 5 ways, but not desire.
Yeah. So often when we talk about these, the proofs for God, the problem with them, I think, is twofold. And when I say problem, understand, I think these are sound arguments, but I think they suffer from 2 difficulties. And the first is that they tend to be really big ideas, the origins of the universe, the metaphysical nature of being, those kind of questions, which most people don't think about in their daily life. And I think they kind of, for some people, can be a little off-putting. They just think, oh, that's too difficult for me to grapple with. That's above my pay grade. And so they just kind of wave it away, or they say, well, I don't see the flaw in your argument, but I can't really understand anyway, so I'm going to just kind of ignore it. So you have that. The other problem with it is that in as much as the arguments are sound, people say, okay, well, I agree there's a first mover, but I don't see how that's the God of the Bible, or I don't see how that's even a God who loves me. Why couldn't that just be, an impersonal God? So it gets you a certain distance down the road, but there's still more work to do. What makes the argument about desire really unique is that it works not at the level of metaphysics or creation, but at the level of the heart, and just says, okay, in your heart you have this desire. And I really, so there's formulations of this. I really like the way Blaise Pascal puts it, but maybe the most famous formulation is C.S. Lewis's. He just puts it like this in Mere Christianity. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. That's the first and most important premise. You wouldn't have an innate kind of inbuilt desire, a desire from birth, unless it was a thing that there was satisfaction for. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. Sexual desire, there's such a thing as sex. That all of these desires, these innate or built-in desires, have a corresponding satisfaction. Now, I'm specifying that these are desires you're born with, because you could imagine, a company promises some amazing new technology, and then they're not able to deliver on it. And you're like, well, I got a desire for that now, and it doesn't exist. It's not real. That's not the kind of desire we're talking about. That's called elicited, kind of created desire. But there's a desire that you're born with. And so that's the first premise. If you're born with a desire, satisfaction for that desire exists. We can see it all across the board. The second, we find in ourselves a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy. That there's something in me that no amount of earthly pleasure will ever satiate. And I think this is a universal experience again. In some people, this is a very explicit kind of desire for God. It's a desire for eternity. In other people, it's just a dissatisfaction with everything that we find on earth. That's the second premise. And so the conclusion then is, well, if those two things are true, the most probable explanation is that it will be satisfied in another world, that there's something not here to satisfy that desire. So if there's a desire, there's a satisfaction. I've got this desire that has no satisfaction here on earth. There must be a satisfaction elsewhere. So it is all at once an argument for the existence of God, but also a God who loved me, who created me, and who has an eternal destiny for me. So it's a really rich vision of God already in the argument for desire. So, I don't think that Pascal or Lewis invents it. I actually think we see Jesus doing a form of this with the woman at the well in Samaria. But that's the basic argument if you were to break it down kind of logically.
Yeah, and a God that you desire, at least implicitly. So it's
that's a really good point, because there are people who say, well, even if your God exists, I wouldn't want him. It's like, well, no, you do. You might not want the way you've heard him described. You might not want to live by his law, but you can only want this kind of God. That there is a part of your heart that you cannot turn off that won't be happy until it rests in God.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think probably the most difficult step would be maybe the recognition of the second premise that my desires aren't filled here on earth.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be what our modus operandi is. It's just moving from one thing to another, trying to make ourselves happy.
Yeah, I'd say here there's an important distinction between distracted and happy. Mm-hmm. Because there's two cures for unhappiness. One is happiness. The other is distraction, where you're still unhappy, but you don't notice you're unhappy because you keep yourself so busy that you don't focus on your unhappiness. And I would say that's not really a cure. That's not really a solution. If your leg is in a lot of pain, you can start hurting your arm so much you don't notice it. You've succeeded by distraction, but you haven't solved the actual problem. And so likewise, we have this deep unhappiness that's at the root of the individual and at the root of the culture that we've been trying to solve with just constant distraction. And so I did a podcast episode recently on this, on my blog podcast, Shem's Potpourri. And I point to Tom Brady, because Tom Brady gave a really remarkable interview on 60 Minutes. And at this point, he'd won maybe 3 Super Bowls. So he's still pretty early in his career. He goes on to win like 7. And the interviewer is just talking about how it feels. He's at the top of his game. He's just been named like the most eligible bachelor. This is shortly before he got married. And he's got fame and fortune and success in every way. He's just beloved. And he says, is this all there is? And the interviewer's really taken aback by it. Because he's just like, surely there's more than this. He's made it to the top and realized what a lonely top it is. And that there's just nothing left to strive for. He could just stay playing football for another decade or two, which is what he ends up doing. But he realizes even then what a pointless kind of existence that is. And it's a really startling sort of interview. I think it's shocking to kind of listen to and say, this is a guy who's having this religious realization without even realizing what it is. Because it's easy for us at the middle or the bottom to say, well, if I had a little more money, a little more success, a little more this, that, or the other, then I'd be happy. But the folks at the top who have those things can say, nope, turns out that doesn't do it. And it's startling to hear that, to just hear the really honest evaluation. You can get that from a lot of people. I don't mean to pick on Tom Brady at all, except to say he's very successful. Right. But you could find, celebrities, politicians, whoever it is, and say, well, are they really happy? And I think they would tell you no. And I think their lifestyles would reveal that the answer is no.
Yeah. I think that's bared out even in statistics that,
yes.
The upper class has the most suicides, higher drug rates, things like that. It's certainly not panacea.
Yeah, but it's easy to believe it is when you don't have it, And so I think the difficulty with the argument from desire, where I find it has the least effectiveness in a certain way, is on people who are too young to know this yet. That they just have to sort of try this for themselves, and then they'll realize, oh, sin doesn't make me happy. Accumulating worldly goods doesn't make me happy. One thing after another, these aren't actually making me happy. Because otherwise you have to have at least the humility to look at those who've gone before you and said, well, it didn't make anyone else happy. Yeah. And this is actually remarkably one of the things Blaise Pascal says when he originally kind of formulates his version of the argument. He says, that a trial so long, so continuous, and so uniform, that is, humanity's constantly tried all of these means and it's never worked. That should certainly convince us of our inability to reach the good by our own efforts. But example teaches us little. It doesn't matter that 1 billion other people have tried this way and it didn't work for them. Maybe it'll work for me. That's kind of the danger. Now, so some people, you're just not going to be able to get through with them with that. Yeah. But for people who've already gone that route and seen it doesn't make them happy, it really works very effectively to just say, okay, let's talk about this. And that's where I think the woman at the well in the Gospel of John is, when Jesus encounters her and he's talking to her. Now, there's a little detail that I think is it's easy to miss. In John chapter 4, verse 5, when Jesus goes into this city, John says it's referred to as Sychar. Well, that's not the real name of the city. It's Shechem. Sychar is a word that means drunken. And so it's a slur. It's a Jewish slur against the Samaritan town. Like it just drunkenness or drunken. And so it is fascinatingly a reference to this way that we try to fill our life with earthly things to make ourselves happy in this way. And drunkenness is a great sign of this. One more drink, one more drink, one more drink, and I'm still not happy. And instead it just ruins my life. Well, likewise, this woman has one more husband, one more husband, one more husband, and she's still not happy. And so Jesus talks to her about it in terms of thirst. He tells her that he's got something that will cure her thirst. And she says, Lord, give me this. And then he tells her, go call your husband. And she says, I have no husband. He says, you're right in saying that, because you've had 5 husbands and the one you have now is not your husband. That he's pointing that she's got a thirst of the heart, and that she's been trying to fill that thirst of the heart with one husband after another. It's that Sychar, that drunkenness. And she says in response to this, sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. And it's really a fascinating thing, because when she goes and leaves at the end of the passage, verse 28 and 29, she leaves her water jar because she realizes this is not what she's really thirsty for. And she goes back into the city and she says to the people, come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ? That what convinces her of Jesus being the Christ is that he knows her heart. And that's where I think the argument from desire is so effective, is it reveals to us something about our hearts that she maybe wasn't aware until that conversation. Like, yeah, I've just been distracting myself with going to the well for the water. There's actually a deeper unhappiness. There's a deeper thirst that's not been quenched, that isn't being met. And so Jesus speaks into that and points to it and is able to draw her from that to the answer to that, which is him. Like, it's not enough to just say, you won't be happy with any earthly good. You won't be happy with any earthly reality. You're made for something more. You have to then say, and there is something more. That Jesus is the living water. That Jesus is the one who can actually satisfy your heart in a way that no one and nothing else ever can.
Yeah. 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 And, that's kind of like what Fulton Sheen says. It's, evangelism is telling, one beggar telling the other beggar where they found food.
Yes,
first tell them you're hungry and then point them to where the food is.
Yeah. And so I think one of the first things to do is help the other person realize that they're hungry or that they're thirsty.
Yeah.
So, you help them see that hunger, that thirst that they already have. And, as the evangelist, as the apologist, you don't have to convince them that they ought to be hungry or thirsty. You just have to get to know them well enough to help them identify it in their own life. Sometimes people know it immediately.
Yeah.
Other times they need to be kind of guided along that process.
I think that's one of the strong points of the argument from desire is the odds are on our side that things are not going right with the person's world. There's always problems when you're dating, or if you're married, there's problems in marriage, there's problems with kids. There's always this, the odds are with us that they're probably already aware this is not a perfect world.
Yeah, very much so. Blaise Pascal, the philosopher and mathematician, he breaks the argument down even a little more than I did. Okay. He starts with just the fact that all men seek happiness. And so if you really want to, dig into the weeds with someone, you can start by saying, well, do you seek happiness? And you might have to define, what do you mean by happiness? The Greeks use eudaimonia, which like good spiritedness. And we don't have a great term, because oftentimes people hear happiness and they think like pleasure. And we mean something deeper, the joy, satisfaction, a real sense of being completed. And, Pascal argues this is the cause of some men going to war and other men abstaining from going to war. And he says this is even the cause of the man who commits suicide, which is a really striking kind of argument. But if you really understand, well, why did that person kill themselves? Well, they were trying to avoid pain. They were trying to seek some kind of happiness they couldn't find. That whether you do the greatest or the worst thing in your life, it's always directed towards the same thing, that you were looking for happiness in some way. That doesn't justify bad action, but it does help us to understand. It helps us to explain, why this bad action happened. And so getting to that point, I think, can be really good for both you and the other person. You, because that way you're not just sitting in judgment of the other person. I see you're making these bad decisions, you horrible person. You can say, okay, I see these really bad choices. What are you trying to get with this? Even to use kind of an analogy from parenting, if you've got a kid who acts up, you can say, okay, what is it they're needing? What is it that's causing them to act this way? Are they needing more attention? Are they needing more structure and discipline? Like what is causing this kind of behavior? Because they're finding a bad way of resolving an actual need. Well, what's the need? And so, Pascal would say, well, at some level, our need is happiness. Our need is this kind of completion that Earth has not found any way of providing an ultimate satisfaction to it. It's not to say we're all totally miserable all the time. We don't have lasting happiness. We don't have, even in the best, healthiest relationship, it's no replacement for the relationship with God. And so, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily filling your life with like horrible things. But whether you're filling your life with sin or with things that aren't sin, they're ultimately, if they're created things, including people, well, they can't fill that infinite kind of chasm, that God-shaped hole. Pope Francis, he in Evangelii Gaudium says, our infinite sadness can only be cured by an infinite love. That's the thing, that there is a hole in my heart that is infinite in depth, that you can throw all of the worldly pleasure in it that you want, and it won't fill it up. And that's the kind of realization. And so, yeah, it's getting people to the point where they realize, like, yes, I am hungry for happiness, and no, my hunger has not been sated. There's something still lacking. And you can say that without turning your nose up at all the earthly goods you have, without turning your nose up at all of the good relationships and good people in your life. You can say, these are all good. This is all wonderful. I'm very thankful for all of this. And yet there's more that I'm hungry for that I've not found. U2's famous line, still haven't found what I'm looking for. That's what it is. It's that hunger for God.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that was something that actually shocked me when I was going through Thomas's Summa Contra Gentiles. He has that section in there about what's the goal. Is it fame? Is it money? And ultimately he ends up with happiness, beatitude. And I thought, if you ask the average Catholic, why are you Catholic? I think probably the last thing they would say is to be happy. That's actually the ultimate goal, is perfect beatitude, perfect happiness.
Yeah, there is unfortunately a strain in Catholic thought that says it doesn't matter if you're happy or not, just do the thing that's right. Yeah. And that is actually a real distortion of Catholic teaching, because Catholic teaching is conformity with the truth is what ultimately makes you happy. And so it's good that you want to be happy. And so if we're out telling people don't be happy, that's not the good news, right? That's bad news. Right. And so the good news is, here's the solution to the problem. Like, here's the solution to the infinite sadness you have. And so, there's a way in which we have to really understand the depths of the problem. Here, I'd put it like this. The Old Testament is full of all these promises. Father Messiah will come and defeat the enemy of Israel and will set Israel free. And so it's easy to imagine, okay, first century Judea, what's the problem? Well, the problem is the Roman occupiers. But no, that's not the problem. The problem is sin. The problem is the demonic occupiers. The problem is, the reign of Satan that has taken over too much command of the earth. And the prince of this world needs to be cast out. And not Caesar. Somebody much more dangerous, much more important than Caesar has to be toppled. And so likewise, when we're talking about happiness, we can think, well, is this going to be really pleasurable in the moment? It's like, okay, but go deeper than that. And here I would say this isn't just a matter of like, I'm going to be miserable on earth and then me happy in heaven, but it is a recognition that sometimes short-term and long-term happiness, there's a trade-off. And I think the obvious example here would be something like having children. Childbirth, not famously pleasant, right? Right. But the short-term pain and agony has this long-term trade-off, the good of having a child, a baby, and all of this. And so even people without religion regularly realize this, right? Or they'll go to work, not because it's like really fun to go to work, but because being employed and the benefits that produces creates more long-term happiness than choosing to be unemployed. And so, again, in earthly life, we can realize regularly my short-term pleasure is at odds with my long-term happiness. Well, so it is in faith, that so often, if I'm really going to be happy in the long term, and including for eternity, I might have to say no to some short-term pleasures. But it's not because I hate happiness. It's because I love happiness and have some idea of how to achieve it properly. Yeah,
that's very good. Yeah, but that requires some maturity.
It does.
Unfortunately, it seems like it's getting more and more scarce in society. people want
I don't know if you're
immediate
familiar with the.
gratification.
I don't know if you're familiar with the marshmallow experiment, but there's this kind of famous psychological experiment where they take 5-year-olds. I think they're 5-year-olds, like between 3 and 5, and they have a timer and a marshmallow, and they put one marshmallow in front of them and said, you can either eat this marshmallow now, or you can wait it's like 2 minutes or something. And if you can wait until the timer goes off, you can have 2 marshmallows. And, the kids all want 2 marshmallows, obviously. Mm-hmm. But some of them are able to wait and some of them aren't. And the videos of this they're hilarious to watch. You see these kids really struggling not to eat this marshmallow. They're like holding it, they're smelling it, they're putting themselves in a near occasion of eating the marshmallow. And a lot of them crack. Well, years on, they go and they study both groups of kids. And what they find is the kids who were able to resist that momentary temptation have phenomenally better life outcomes than the kids who couldn't. In every measurable area. They're less likely to be in gangs. They're more likely to graduate high school. They're more likely to, like in every way you can measure life success. The kids who could say no to that momentary itch of temptation are just happier and more successful. And so that's one of those things that from a very, very young age, you can learn. And as parents, I would say you can teach your kids, can you say no to this little pleasure now for a bigger one? And in the case of like a little kid, it might be 2 minutes from now, 5 minutes from now. With older kids, it's a little farther down the road. That you see this, I would say, even in kind of the story of Scripture. In the Old Testament, especially early on, the rewards and punishments have to be pretty immediate. It's as they grow that God starts to talk more and more about the afterlife, and that the reward and punishment can be further down the road. Well, likewise, when you're raising kids, it's not enough to say, don't hit your brother, you're more likely to go to heaven, right? Like that doesn't work. It has to be, you're going to be rewarded or punished in a minute, not when you die. And so there's that kind of pedagogical thing, because you're right. If you don't have that, if you're not formed in that, it's very hard to understand that I could actually be happier by denying myself for a moment. And that when I'm denying myself, it's again, not because I hate happiness, but because I love it enough to want more of it later.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that needs to be conveyed. But the thing is, what is it? That happiness, earthly happiness, like terminates with its use. That is like eating a potato chip. You got to have another one as soon as you eat it.
Yeah, and, they even advertise that you can't eat just one. It's like, well, yeah, that's a problem, though, right?
Yeah, right.
If this was really good, I could.
So you would expect that experience would teach you that, boy, I'm eating an awful lot of potato chips, and there's got to be something better.
Is after you eat the potato chips, who finishes eating a bunch of potato chips and says, "I'm really glad I did that. Like that feels good. I feel better about my life and about my day now." It's like, no, the pleasure with it really is. I mean, like you said, the pleasure terminates with its use. As soon as it's been swallowed, I don't enjoy it anymore, and in fact, I start to resent it. It's like, well, right. I've got this big sack of potato on my stomach. That doesn't feel great.
Yeah. So it's, so I think like you said, I think there's a lot of things going for this particular argument that you simply don't get with the cosmological argument, right, or so on and so forth. Although it is interesting enough, it's almost like a contingency argument, right? Because you don't have the desire isn't satiated from within, but only from without. Yeah,
no, it's true. It implies a lot of things metaphysically and philosophically, but it does I think it does a neat job of sidestepping some of those debates, because even the whole createdness, because someone could argue, well, maybe this is all evolutionary, and I don't think that's a very satisfying kind of argument. I don't think it's hard to explain from an evolutionary perspective, unguided by any kind of divine hand, how we end up with this hunger for God. Like, why would we have a species that's A, self-aware, and B, unhappy with all earthly goods? That doesn't seem to be, an asset that's going to be naturally selected for. And so, this a lingering sense of existential unhappiness, like, why would we be evolved to have that at our core? And yet that's what I think someone would have to say in response to it. Or the other argument is just, well, this doesn't really exist. I don't have this hunger. And that's just a form of kind of self-unawareness, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And it's transparent too. I think if someone says that that it doesn't exist, I think people won't buy it.